Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fritz Kuhnlens, and welcome back for another installment of our Alumni webinar series. Our Alumni webinar series is dedicated to helping alumni tackle the challenges of finding success in music and the arts. Everything from budgeting to moving across the country to better understanding new technologies in our daily and professional routines. We hope that this series gives you tools, tips, and new perspectives on how to approach the ever-increasing fast-paced world. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to discuss the webinar's format and set some ground rules for the discussion. This webinar is sponsored by the Berklee Office of Alumni Affairs. The Office of Alumni Affairs is dedicated to building and connecting the vast communities of college and conservatory alumni worldwide. Every year, we hold over 100 in-person events from LA to New York to London to Tokyo, designed to connect alumni from across the music universe and the arts. Be sure to check out our website for news, alumni profiles, and events updates from around the community. Today's webinar is meant to provide tips, tricks, and advice for alumni from the college and the conservatory communities. The format is 40-minute discussion followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A. Our Q&A will be curated by our Alumni Affairs staff, so again, please use the question and/or chat functions as part of the webinar platform to deliver your questions, and we will prompt the questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please note that our presenters consist of faculty, staff, and fellow alumni in the industry. The views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the college policy or position of Berklee College of Music and/or the Boston Conservatory at Berklee. In a couple of moments, we will welcome our special guest to discuss today's topic. For today's topic, we will be discussing the New York City rental market. For many of us, just the thought of renting in New York City is challenging enough. For those of us who have taken the plunge already, perhaps our first New York City rental isn't the Brooklyn pied-à-terre that we had dreamed about. All of this while still trying to manage the challenges and rigors of being an artist, musician, dancer, professional in the Big Apple. Today's guest is Kathleen Lamagna, a Boston Conservatory at Berklee alumna and successful real estate broker in the city. Kathleen has been on both sides of the real estate fence. A native New Yorker, Kathleen always knew she wanted to be part of the Big Apple. Moving to New York City from Boston with her friends, Kathleen set her sights on Broadway and musical theater gigs in the city. But the city's not so elegant art of sublets versus rentals, Queens versus Brooklyn, uptown versus downtown can be tricky on the best days. After helping countless friends with the rental circus, Kathleen set her sights on learning the business. Since gaining her real estate license, Kathleen has both rented and sold hundreds of properties in Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and beyond. Today, Kathleen is here to educate us on the New York City rental market. How and where do you get the biggest bang for your buck? The tools and tricks you need when approaching the rental market. This webinar is designed for both the consummate New York City renter as well as those alumni thinking about making a change to the Big Apple. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kathleen Lamagna, and I'm going to turn the webinar over to Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Hi, everybody. Yes, Fritz gave me a lovely introduction, but my name is Kathleen Lamagna. I graduated from the Conservatory in 2013, and a big reason why I decided to get my real estate license was for a couple reasons. One, because it was flexible in the sense that I could, it seemed to me like a good way to make some money, give myself some staying power in New York while also being able to pursue a theater career. And the other reason why I wanted to get into the business was because when I was a junior, I watched all of my friends that were seniors. I ended up staying in Boston the summer between my junior year and my senior year. And I watched all of my classmates come to and from New York, back and forth from New York to Boston, talking about how frustrating the Manhattan apartment hunting process was. And nobody really seemed to have a great answer on how the process works and what's required. And they were just sort of coming to look at apartments without knowing what they needed to have prepared. And I felt like if that was something, if I could sort of learn that beast, then I can help those classmates that came after me, and hopefully artists from other schools that were in other programs around the country make their transition to New York a little smoother, because it is a crazy and hectic city, but it's also a ton of fun. And I think everybody has sort of their stories of moving to New York, and my goal is to help at least smooth out the housing process. So helping Berklee students is the closest thing to my heart. So I'm happy to be here and sort of guide you through what the process looks like. We're mostly going to be talking about what it takes to sign a lease and what that process looks like. However, I am going to start with the differences between finding a sublet versus signing a lease for a year or 2 years. I think a lot of times when people move to New York, they're not quite sure which way to go. Subletting, there are a lot of unknowns when people are moving to the city, especially right after graduation. Not everybody has a job secured. You're not quite sure. Some people don't know the city's geography and where they would feel most comfortable. So a lot of times when I work with clients that are just graduating or they're just finishing their senior year, one of the things that I talk them through first is the difference between subletting and signing a lease. So subletting means that's generally it's a temporary short-term solution. And you're generally looking to fill one room in an apartment. Usually those rooms are furnished, and you are filling somebody's room while if they're another artist and they're out on a gig, if they're gone for a couple months, they may be looking for somebody to fill in for, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, just depending upon how long they won't be there. Though another thing about subletting that's different from signing a lease is that there are no upfront costs and there are no qualifying standards. So when you are looking for a temporary space, nobody is going to be asking you to put down a first month's rent and a security deposit or anything like that. And I'll get to that stuff a little bit later, but you're avoiding some of those things. So it's kind of a nice way to test the waters and figure out, is renting a room for $900 a month, is that going to be something that I'm going to be able to do long term? Or do I like this particular neighborhood that I'm subletting in? I think it's a nice way to give yourself a little bit of a test run with the city, where you feel comfortable in the city, where your friends are, how close you are to your friends. It gives you time to learn the subway systems. It gives you time to maybe get a job. Everybody sort of prioritizes those things differently, but I think those are some of the positives about subletting, is that you can buy yourself a little bit of time. Some of the negatives of subletting are that it is a little bit like the wild, wild west when it comes to finding a sublet. There are no sanctioned processes involved, so you really are just dealing with whoever the leaseholder is and what they feel comfortable with. And the vetting process is up to the person that is actually on the lease. So when it comes to, they could be interviewing 10 to 20 people for that one particular room. And, there's no real set guidelines in terms of how you're going to secure that room. Sometimes people will ask for some sense of security deposit. So that would be something that I would keep an eye out for. But there aren't, as you'll see when it comes to signing a lease, there are certain boxes that need to be checked. In these particular circumstances, there aren't. The other thing that I want to caution you about when subletting is that I would never, ever, ever turn over any money to anybody until you've actually seen the apartment in person and you've met, at the very least, the person that you would be subletting from, but ideally the roommates as well. People have come to me often where they've been in quote unquote subletting situations that haven't been so great, or they've given money to somebody ahead of time without meeting them, and it turned out to be a scam, or somebody that was, they'd been catfished, or it wasn't the situation that they thought that they were going to be in. So that's my biggest caution, biggest red flag would be if anybody asks you to put any money down before you have seen the space or have met the roommates. That would be, I would caution you against moving forward with something like that. A couple resources that I know people use to find sublets are Ghostlight Housing, which is a Facebook group online. It was formerly called Gypsy Housing. They changed the name to Ghostlight Housing, and that is a platform for anybody, but I think it has sort of an artist slant in terms of who is posting their rooms and stuff up for rent. So I would check that. A lot of times I would just Facebook source your friends, because a lot of times, especially with artists, we all sort of know somebody who's leaving or coming and going, needs a room filled, or somebody that's looking for a room. So I would not hesitate to post that you're either looking for something or you're trying to get a room filled, because I know a lot of people that have had success that way without having to open it up beyond their Facebook friends and beyond their social network. The other resource that I haven't used myself, or I've not worked with anybody who's used it, although it is becoming popular in New York, is Roomy. They have, I believe it's an app, but there's also a website. Oops, sorry. The website is www.roomyapp.com. I've known a couple people indirectly that have had success that way. I can't speak too much about it, but it might be worth exploring. So that sort of sums up what subletting looks like on a basic level. But what we're really going to be talking about today is what it takes to sign a lease. So the differences between signing a lease and subletting are that when you are signing a lease, you are, and I'm assuming most people have done this in Boston, although maybe some people stayed on campus all 4 years too. But when you're signing a lease, you're signing the document that says that you will be paying a certain rent price for whatever the lease term is. Generally in New York City, it's 1 year. There are some circumstances where you can get a 2-year lease, but normally your first year of renting with a particular landlord is a 1-year lease, and they'll generally give you an option to do a 2-year lease after a 2-year lease renewal. So after that first year is complete. And you're saying, I'm on the line to pay this amount of money every month for the next year. When you sign a lease, it's a full apartment. So if it's a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, you're getting an entire apartment, an entire unfurnished apartment. So you would be responsible for furnishing that yourself. I will talk more about this later as well, but with signing a lease, there are some upfront costs that are involved. Normally, what I tell people is to be prepared to pay 3 to 4 months rent upfront, and I'll break that down for you in a little bit. The other thing about signing a lease in New York is that you have to qualify financially, and if you don't, you'll have to have somebody else that signs on that can qualify. More on this later. It is a process that you follow from beginning to end. A couple of resources that you can use when you're looking to sign a lease is use a broker or an agent. And a lot of people, in terms of finding things online yourself, the biggest website that I would recommend is streeteasy.com. I know there are some other websites out there. People use Zillow. There was a time where Naked Apartments was really popular, but my recommendation is to really only look at StreetEasy. And the reason for that is that StreetEasy only allows one apartment to be advertised at once. So you eliminate I can't say fully eliminate, but you reduce your chances of sort of getting the runaround with a broker advertising the same apartment. So the apartment can only be advertised one time by one broker, and I find it to be the most foolproof. All right, so let's say that you've considered your subletting options and you're signing a lease options and you decide that you're going to be looking to sign a lease. A lot of times when I work with clients, I will ask them to send me an email with some of the things that they're looking for. And I will get a range of different requests and priorities. Some people want things to be renovated. They want to have a dishwasher. They want to have laundry in the building. They don't want to be above a certain floor. They want to have an elevator, things like that. But when you're evaluating when and how you want to move to New York and if you want to sign a lease, I would say the three biggest priorities that you should be focusing on are the type of space you want, the price, and the location. Type of space meaning a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, a studio. Price meaning what you think is a realistic budget, and we'll talk about that. And then location in terms of where you want to be, either in Manhattan or outside of Manhattan. What I will break down for you now is to sort of talk about how those three items come into play in some specific neighborhoods. So here we have a map of Manhattan and a couple of the surrounding boroughs. So when you're evaluating these three things, the biggest thing to know is that the closer you are to all the hustle and bustle of the city, the more expensive things are. And as you work your way away from that, the more bang you get for your buck in terms of space and price. Meaning like you will get, apartments will be larger for a cheaper price. So if you're looking around the Midtown area where you see Times Square and Herald Square and Bryant Park, this stuff is some of the most expensive, as well as downtown Manhattan when you're looking at, the West Village, Soho, the East Village. Some of that stuff is more expensive. I would say artists that work with me are generally looking in three areas. The first is Upper Manhattan, which is north of 110th Street, where you see Cathedral Parkway right above Central Park there, all the way up to Inwood. And I'll break this down for you even more in a minute. The second area is Queens, which is to the east of Manhattan. So a lot of people live in Astoria, Queens, which is right off the NW train. Right to the east of Manhattan. And then the other area that a lot of artists look in is Brooklyn, which is southeast of Manhattan. So let's talk about what you can expect to be paying in these three different areas. What I did here was sort of break down an average cost of studios and 1-bedrooms, 2-bedrooms, and 3-bedrooms in Upper Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. So on average in Upper Manhattan, studios and 1-bedrooms are coming in around $2,150. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find things on both ends of that spectrum. And also, when it comes to Upper Manhattan, this encompasses a lot of the island, so prices will vary accordingly. So for the stuff that's a little farther south, in South Harlem, which is like north, it's right north of Central Park. Here, I have a slide here. So if you're looking in South Harlem, which is right above Central Park, and here in this map, it encompasses Central Harlem. This area here would be the most expensive in terms of finding 1-bedrooms. And then, it gradually decreases the farther north you go. So if you're looking at where the number 12 is, all the way up in Inwood, that's where you're going to find some of the cheaper studios and 1-bedrooms. Studios there are coming in around $1,600 to $1,650. And 1-bedrooms you can still find for $1,900 to $2,000. Same with 2 bedrooms. The average is $2,700, but again, that's incorporating South Harlem, which is where you're going to be paying a little more. So probably closer to $29,000 or $3,000 a month for a 2 bedroom. And then the farther north you go, things become cheaper. So I think it's realistic to be looking for something in the $2,300 to $2,400 range for a 2 bedroom. I have gotten people recently who are still expecting to pay, $2,000 for a 2 bedroom, which would be $1,000 each. And unfortunately, those options are becoming sort of fewer and far between. So that is something to think about too. The other thing that I will say is that the price per person decreases the more roommates you have. So if you move here expecting to pay around $1,000, which I would say is the norm, you may want to consider a 3 bedroom in order to make that happen and be a little closer to sort of the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. And then we'll go back to the 3 bedrooms. The average price is $3,150. If we're looking at Brooklyn, so I would say like some of the cheaper neighborhoods in Brooklyn are Flatbush, Bed-Stuy, Stuy Heights, and Crown Heights. There you'll find studios and 1 bedrooms around $2,350. 2 bedrooms you can get away with $2,550. There's some stuff that was coming in that was cheaper than that also. So Brooklyn and Queens are probably where you're going to get a little bit of a better deal when it comes to a 2 bed. And 3 beds were considerably cheaper there too. And then in Queens, I would say most artists land in the Astoria Sunnyside areas. Again, this is a huge generalization, so there are so many variations that we can discuss and tailor based off of your specific needs. This is generally where I think a lot of artists land in, where they get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of space. So yeah, we're looking at like around $2,200 for 1 bedrooms. For 2 bedrooms, we're looking around $2,500, and for 3 bedrooms, we're looking at around $3,125. The other important thing that I want to say is that, a lot of times people come to the city with the expectation that they're going to be finding that some of these prices, they come with somewhat unrealistic expectations in that they're going to be getting things that are super cheap. And everybody sort of has a story of, well, my dad's brother's uncle was living in New York 20 years ago and he was renting in a rent-controlled apartment and he was only paying $300 a month. So I'm looking for something along those lines. And what we call those are the unicorn apartments, because generally speaking, that stuff doesn't really exist anymore. So the main reason why I wanted to give you this as sort of a guide is to also set some realistic expectations in terms of what you should be expecting to pay. There was a time where you could be getting things for cheaper in these neighborhoods. I started real estate about 6 years ago, and when I first started, I was renting 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms for $1,300 and $1,400 a month, and 2 beds for $1,800 to $1,900 a month. But as these neighborhoods are becoming more popular, those numbers are non-existent and they're unrealistic. So I do think that having this cheat sheet will give you an idea of what you can expect to get. And I think I think it's important to sort of be comfortable with these numbers or have them in your head so that you know what you're up against. And if you are pleasantly surprised and find something cheaper than that, then great. And again, things definitely do exist under these numbers. They're just a little fewer and far between. So start thinking in this range when you are talking to roommates or you're figuring out where you want to live. So I did break down some of these areas in Upper Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, just to give you all a sense. Also, I think it's important we can revert back to the subway map as well, so you can tell excuse me, how easily you can get to and from Midtown, which is generally where most people are commuting from every day. So if we're going back to Upper Manhattan, if that's something that you're interested in, I would say definitely look at Central Harlem, Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, and Inwood. Washington Heights and Inwood are going to be where you get the cheapest. You're going to find the cheapest apartments. Hamilton Heights is in the 140s in Broadway. Riverside Drive is as far west, and then it goes to St. Nicholas Avenue to your east. Hamilton Heights has become pretty popular, not only because of the musical Hamilton, but because there are a lot of new bars and restaurants in that area. So prices there tend to come in a little bit higher. Central Harlem is great because you're right off of a 2-3 express train, so it gets you to Midtown super easily. I sort of lived in between. I lived in Hamilton Heights when I first moved to New York, and then I moved to Central South Harlem, and I was there for 4 years, and it was great. I was right off of a 2-3 train, and I could get to the Upper West Side and Midtown in about 15 minutes max. So I was really happy there. I'm also somebody who greatly prioritizes location. That's important to me. So being next to a train line, being able to get somewhere quickly was a big priority for me when I was looking, and it still is. Great. So now we'll look at Brooklyn a little bit. So most of the places that I gave you in terms of numbers, you're looking, it's like Bed-Stuy, which is labeled as number 3. A lot of people like Bushwick, which is labeled as number 4. Crown Heights is also really popular, which is where the 8 is, Crown Heights and Prospect Heights. All of those neighborhoods are great. You're off of some great train lines there too. Crown Heights is close to the 4-5 if you want to be on the east side, or also the 2-3. You have a lot of great train options, and things are usually a little cheaper out there too. What you will notice is that the closer you get to Manhattan, the more expensive things become. So Williamsburg, Dumbo, Brooklyn Heights, those are all a little pricier. You will get a little more space than if you were in Midtown, but I would expect the numbers to be a little higher when you're looking at listings. And then we'll move on to Queens. So I would say most people sort of land in that Astoria, which is labeled number 1. I know a few people that are also live in Sunnyside and love Sunnyside. These both have trains that get you to Midtown relatively quickly, super quickly. So I also think that they're great options to look at. The one thing that I will tell you about Astoria and Sunnyside is that the real estate market is a little different in Queens than it is in Brooklyn and Manhattan, in the sense that a lot of times you're renting from private owners that own homes, and they rent out a certain number of units in the home. So they may live on the 1st floor, and then they rent out the 2nd floor and the 3rd floor. So if you decide to work with a broker, they definitely exist in Astoria. And if we end up working together, I could certainly help you and guide you in Astoria. But sometimes access is a little bit harder because private owners don't necessarily want to be dealing with brokers, and they want to do things themselves. So it's just something that I would be thinking about. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It just means that you're going to be a little bit more on your own when it comes to finding a place. All right, so let's say that you have found the perfect apartment, or you have an idea of where you want to be, how many roommates you're going to be having, and what kind of neighborhood and what kind of space you want. The next thing that you need to be thinking about is to make sure that you will qualify financially. So the general rule of thumb that you need to be thinking about when you're looking for a place is that landlords are going to want to see that your annual income is 40 times the monthly rent and your credit score is 680 or higher. So for example, if you're looking for a place that's $2,000 a month, they're going to want to see that your income is around $80,000 a year. So this can be combined. So if you're living with a roommate, then as long as the two of you hit $80,000 a year, that's fine. Landlords don't care if one person makes $50,000 and the other makes 30, or how that's divided. One person could hit that number themselves. That's fine, but these are the general qualifications. So when you are looking to see if you'll qualify for something, have this in mind and sort of do the math ahead of time in terms of, if we want a $3,000 apartment a month, do we have 120K? Are we making that a year? If you do not hit those numbers, there are a couple different options and a couple different ways that you can go. The first option is to have a guarantor or multiple guarantors. Now, guarantors work differently in New York than they do in Boston, where I believe in Boston, they sign on the lease as co-signers. And in this circumstance, they are signing on they're not actual leaseholders. They're signing on and saying that they will guarantee, they'll be next in line for the rent payment should one of you default, or should you default a month's rent or something like that. They're the ones that are on the hook next. There's generally a separate guarantor page that they will need to sign that goes with the lease. The financial qualifications for guarantors are that they make 80 times the monthly rent and they have credit scores of 680 or higher. The reason that they want 80 times the monthly rent is landlords are going to want to see that the guarantors make enough to pay for both their own expenses and the applicant's expenses. So that's why it's double. Should they need to, they want to know that guarantors make enough for themselves and for the applicants. One of the things, and I will update this slide before we send it out, but the other option, if you don't have guarantors, are third-party guarantor services. One of them that I know of off the top of my head is called Insurant. And this is a service that you can pay on a monthly basis, and I think it's minimal. I haven't had too many clients use it, but I had one, I think the most recent client I had was like a year ago. But I believe they pay a small monthly fee. I think it was around like $20 a month or $25 a month for this third-party service to guarantee you on the lease. Not every landlord accepts Insurant or a third-party guarantor. So if you do end up needing to go that route, my suggestion would just be to be very upfront about the fact that you'll be using a third-party guarantor, and you'll want to make sure that the landlord is okay with that before you apply. Otherwise, I don't want you to be in a position where you apply for something and then they don't take you on the basis of that, and then you're out application fees. So the next slide is probably the most important slide of today, only in the sense that this has everything that you need it's a list of things that you're going to eventually need to have ready when you're ready to apply for a place. This list is the same for applicants and guarantors, and I like to send it out to my clients early for a couple of reasons. The first is that the rental market in New York moves really, really quickly. So what's different in Boston is that people start to look in the winter for a September 1st lease start date. And in New York, landlords only look at applications until they look at them 3 weeks before your move-in date. So if you're looking to sign a lease on September 1st, the absolute earliest that you can apply for something would be August 10th. And that's because the turnover rate in Manhattan is so high and people are moving in and out all the time. So landlords don't have to wait a long period of time before they know somebody else will come in and rent the apartment. And they're not willing to hold the apartment without getting rent for, 3 or 4 months until the next person is ready to move in. So one of the reasons why it's important to send this list to my clients ahead of time is so that when they decide on what their move-in date is going to be, and when they decide to come in, when they hit that 3-week mark and they are ready to hit the ground running and look for an apartment, I try to prep them so that they have this list ready to go before they even start their search. And this reason is because there's a lot of competition, and because the market moves so quickly, that if you have it all assembled in one place before you find your apartment, then all you'll have to do when you find it is fill out the particular application for that specific unit. You'll have all of these documents ready to go, and you'll be ready to submit them on the spot, and it ensures, or at least betters your chance of getting the apartment that you love. So we'll go through this list quickly. So they'll ask for a photo ID, a letter of employment, your 3 most recent pay stubs, your most recent tax returns or W-2s, your 3 most recent bank statements, and then if you have any significant assets or savings that show that you're overqualified, we always suggest putting a statement in there that shows that, mostly because more is better in this circumstance. They feel more secure. And then very rarely, but I have seen this happen, some landlords will ask for Social Security cards. It doesn't happen as often, but sometimes they will ask for that. So this list of documents is required for both applicants and guarantors. And this is really the second reason why I like to send this out right away, is because it's a lot of information, and it's a lot of confidential information, and it's a lot of paperwork. And when guarantors see it, they're usually taken by surprise if they haven't had experience renting in Manhattan previously. I think Manhattan is the only place that asks for this much paperwork, and oftentimes it's more paperwork than what you would need to even qualify for a mortgage. But the reason that they ask for it is because New York is such a tenant-friendly city that once they get you into an apartment, it is extremely difficult to get you out of one if you're not paying rent or if you're a bad tenant. So this is really the landlord's only chance that they have to vet their applicants. So a lot of times it takes guarantors a minute to sort of warm up to this process, and rightfully so. You're turning over a lot of confidential documentation. So I like to get this out so that, and I've seen this happen before, if it doesn't get sent out early, what will happen is if you find something and you don't have the paperwork prepared, a lot of times when this list goes out and guarantors have to put this together in a short period of time, it's when I see deals fall apart or applicants not getting the apartment that the apartment of their dreams, because guarantors need some time to wrap their brain around the fact that a landlord is asking for this much information, and they don't want to turn it over, and then they oftentimes won't get the apartment. When I speak to guarantors, I personally am more than happy to talk to guarantors on the phone at any point of the process, whether it's 3 months before you're ready to start looking or the week before. I always like to get guarantors involved right away because it is sort of hard to wrap your brain around, and I'm happy to talk them through all of this if it's something that you as an applicant don't necessarily feel comfortable with. The other thing that I will say is that they can, because it's a lot of confidential information, my suggestion is to block out account numbers, block out social security numbers. and redact things before you send them, and that should be fine. Landlords will want to do a credit check, so they will need to have everybody's social security number at some point during the application process. However, if you want to redact them from these documents and give the number over the phone or something like that, that should be fine. The other thing is that you don't need to, when you come to New York and you have your paperwork together, you don't have to have hard copies of them. You can have them all on a file on your computer that you can send right away as soon as you fill out an application. Similarly to subletting and turning over money without having seen an apartment in person, never, ever, ever send any kind of confidential documentation to an agent, whether it's me or somebody else, without ahead of time, before you come to New York or before you have a specific apartment in mind that you want to apply for. I've been in situations before where people will want it done and out of their hands, and they'll send me stuff before they even hit NYC. And I don't like holding on to anybody's confidential information until I absolutely need it. And I ask people, I'll delete it right away and I'll tell them to send it to me right before you're ready to apply for a specific apartment, because you just never want to take any chances. And anybody that asks you for it before you apply for something, that would be a huge red flag, and I would caution you against working with that person. All right, let's talk about some of the upfront costs that you can expect to be paying when you apply for an apartment. So the general rule of thumb that I tell people is to prepare to put down 3 to 4 months rent upfront. That will include your first month's rent. Generally speaking, landlords ask for a 1-month security deposit, and then it will also include your application fee and your broker fee. Application fees, you should normally, there have been some new rent laws that have been passed very recently, and there's been some debate over application fee charges. So you should be seeing application fees now come in around $20 per person. There was a time where it was closer to $100, but I would say the average right now and what's most normal is $20 per person. Now that includes it's per person, meaning $20 for an applicant and $20 for a guarantor. So if you are applying with one guarantor, it would be $40 total, or if you are applying with 2 guarantors, it'd be $60 total. So that's first month's rent, 1 month security, and then the broker fee. There are a couple different ways that a broker fee can go. And it really ranges anywhere between 1 month's rent to 15% of the annual lease. I would say it's kind of complicated in the sense that, and it would probably be something that if we were working together, I could break down for you kind of on a per apartment basis. So I'll try to make this as broad as possible. 15% of the annual lease would only happen if 2 brokers were splitting the commission with one listing. So it would mean that the landlord has a broker that they hire only to represent their properties, and you are working with a broker to help you find something. So if that is the case, then there would be a 15% broker fee that would be split 7.5% to the applicant's broker and to the landlord's broker. Now, if we were working together and I had access to landlords directly, which I do, then the lowest price that I would be able to give you as a broker fee would be 1 month's rent. So if it's a situation where a landlord doesn't care who represents them in the transaction, then we would do the deal directly with the landlord or the management company, and you would be paying 1 month's rent. So it would be first month's rent, a 1 month security deposit, and a 1 month broker fee. When it comes to the process, when you apply, you're only going to be paying the application fees. And then when you actually sign the lease, that's when you'll be bringing your first month's rent, 1 month security deposit, and the broker fee. The other types of listings that you may see online, which are tricky, are no fee listings. And what that means is that the landlord is paying the fee themselves. There are some nuances here that are a little complicated to get into for the purposes of this conversation. But a couple things that I will caution you about with no fee apartments. First of all, there are plenty of great no fee apartments out there. So I wouldn't necessarily stay away from them. I think that you can find some no fee stuff that's really great. And a lot of times I work with landlords who pay the broker fee. So I love doing the no fee deals. I think that clients of mine have gotten some great no fee deals, and I'm happy to do them. Sometimes it gets tricky because the landlord is paying the fee, they will tend to price their apartments higher than what a fee apartment would be in the same neighborhood. So if you are planning on being somewhere for a year, then I would say for a year and just a year, then I would say a no fee apartment is the way to go, because you're not paying anything up front other than the first month's rent and 1 month security deposit. And after a year, you'll be in and out of there, and you're not sinking a ton of money into the space that you're going to live in. If you want to be somewhere for a long period of time, I may suggest, or I would at least be open to paying a broker fee, even though it's a little painful at the beginning. If you want to be somewhere for a while, you also have to consider the fact that you are going to be having a rent increase every year. So if you go with something that's a no fee space that's priced higher, your rent is going to increase off of that number versus the apartment that may be priced a little lower that you had to pay a fee on. So with a no fee place, you are sort of paying that. You're not necessarily escaping that cost. It's just coming at a later date if you decide to renew. The other thing about broker fee or no fee apartments are that sometimes there are things about an apartment that are undesirable, which is why a landlord offers that incentive for somebody to rent the space. So when you're out there looking, I would definitely be open to looking at no fee places and fee places, so that you can compare and contrast them and sort of make sure that it's just a generous landlord who is offering this incentive, and not that there's something undesirable about the apartment, whether it has like a mini fridge or the bathrooms and the shower is in the kitchen or something like that makes a lot of renters not want to live there. Again, this is a sort of a complicated concept, so we can break this down in depth at a later time. So let's talk about the benefits of using an agent. First thing is, you don't have to use an agent at all. There are several circumstances where you can look online, look at these listings, and make appointments for yourself. The hard part about not having an agent, especially when you're moving to New York for the first time, is that it is exhausting if you don't necessarily know the neighborhoods well, and it is harder to streamline the process for yourself. It does feel like a little bit like it's the Wild West, and it is nice to have somebody that is there to sort of take you through it from beginning to end, talk to your guarantors, and get everybody on the same page, especially if you are living with multiple people. I think that is sort of the biggest challenge that I find, is that when groups of people move into apartments together, whether if you're looking at a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom plus guarantors, it does get complicated when everybody is trying to get on the same page. So having one person sort of be the point of contact that you're funneling everything through makes things easier. It also saves you time when it comes to making appointments for yourself. A lot of times I try to block my clients out in 2-hour chunks, and we can usually see about 8 to 10 apartments in those 2 hours. I don't like to go more than that because I think after a certain point, all the apartments tend to look the same. And so it's harder to keep track of them. But that is certainly helpful when it comes to seeing things quickly, especially if you have a tough schedule. The other thing that an agent will do for you is negotiate the lease term. So there are times when you can negotiate a rent price with the landlord, or you can ask for them to add something into the apartment, or to maybe the appliances look old and you would like to get new appliances. Maybe you're not quite qualified, but you're close without a guarantor and you want to see if the landlord will take you without having to use one. That's where having an agent becomes super helpful because they can often try to help you save a little money or get the best deal possible for your place. They are also helping you put all this paperwork together and assembling it and presenting it to the landlord in a clean, easy to read format, which can make a difference. And they're also working on your behalf. When you work with somebody that just represents the landlord, they don't have as much personal investment in you and whether or not you are the right fit for the apartment. But if you're working with somebody, they will be that push that you may need. And that is really it. I know we have a couple questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I think this is sort of the general process, but hopefully we'll break some stuff down for you more specifically. And my email address is here. Please feel free to use it at any time so that even if it's just a question, hey, Kathleen, what do you think about this area? Or what do you think I can get here? I am more than happy to correspond with you via email, or we can hop on the phone and I can talk you through some of this stuff, whether you're trying to move next week or if you're trying to move 3 years from now. I am so happy to help, and I'm especially happy to help anybody that comes from Berklee. It has such a special place in my heart, and they're my most favorite clients, and I would love to meet you all in person. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Fritz.
Thank you, Kathleen.
You're welcome.
This was great. And for those of you who don't know, Kathleen Lamagna is also on our volunteer leadership group in the New York City area. So chances are, if you do find yourself in New York over the next 3 weeks or 3 years, you're probably going to see her at one of the upcoming events. So, so thank you so much for that. We're going to open it up to the Q&A now. So please use the questions feature built into the GoToWebinar control panel to enter in your questions, and then we'll curate those questions and ask them to Kathleen with the time that we have remaining. So I've got a couple of questions for you, Kathleen, coming from Carolyn. The first is, how would you get connected with a person that owns the house and rents out the other floors? So I think she's talking about Astoria, Queens area. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yep. So a lot of times they will be advertising themselves on StreetEasy. So it won't necessarily mean that you'll have to hunt through a newspaper or anything like that. You'll find it online. They may just not be open to working with brokers, which is fine.
Okay. Another question coming in is, can you talk a little bit about rent stabilization? Someone has a question regarding that they're thinking about moving to New York from Los Angeles, and in their Google search of sort of learning a little bit of the lay of the land, they've seen a lot of sort of topics around rent stabilization. Is that sort of a real thing? Is that something that you see a lot in your business? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so rent stabilization is a little bit different from rent controlled apartments, which no longer exist. Rent controlled means that we that the apartment truly cannot, the rent cannot be any higher than whatever the agreed upon price is, and it's never going to increase. Rent stabilized means that the apartment price will increase year after year, but it can only increase based off of a certain percentage that the Real Estate Board of New York votes on each year. So for somebody that's searching, a rent stabilized apartment is more desirable than what we call a free market apartment, because there are specific guidelines that the landlord has to meet. So you know that your rent will not be able to increase a certain amount each year. They're sort of harder to find. They're fewer and far between, but Uptown and Brooklyn definitely still have a lot of rent stabilized units. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities that you could get one. But it does vary on a per apartment basis. So just because one apartment is stabilized doesn't mean that the whole building in the apartment, the whole building of apartments is stabilized, if that makes sense. It's particularly a hot topic right now because Governor Cuomo passed some new rent laws that are very friendly to the rent stabilized tenant. So that's probably why you're seeing a lot in the news about it. But to be in a rent stabilized apartment is a great thing in the sense that you're extremely protected.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got another question from Bryce. I have a May 1st move out date. Are apartments open most all the time year round, or is it mostly September 1st? And I should start looking in April. I think this is probably Bryce talking a little bit about the differences between the Boston market and the New York market. Kathleen, you want to talk a little bit about that?
So you can find an apartment at any time of the year in New York. So if you are looking to move out, so if you're wanting if your lease ends on May 1st, then you can certainly start to look in April, and like around April 10th is when you would be looking. So, but you can also sort of do something if you're moving from Boston to New York or from another area to New York, you can maybe give yourself like a couple weeks of overlap. So if you want to start looking at the beginning of April to maybe move in, even if your New York lease would have a May 1st start date, you can, if the apartment's vacant, then they'll allow you to move in at any time and you'll prorate the rent. So it's very possible that you could, move in to the new place on April 20th and give yourself a little bit of time to overlap. I don't know if I answered that correctly, but I think that's what we're going for.
Bryce, let us know if we answered that question correctly, or if you'd like a little bit more clarification. The next question comes from Connor. What areas do you think are best for finding a cheaper apartment nearby rehearsal studios? Thinking about trying to find a cheap room in PLG and getting a small lockout for practice and rehearsals. What are your thoughts on that?
I know that there are some rehearsal studio spaces in Brooklyn. I'm not as familiar with them and their locations, but I would say maybe start in Brooklyn, specifically in Bushwick. I would look there. Anything in Manhattan, I think anything that gets you off of anywhere you're off of an express train is great. So anything off of an 8 train or a 2 or a 3 train would be a great place to start.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. And it looks like we did answer Bryce's question. So great job. Another question that we've got coming through is, are there any specific websites that deal with sort of family renting, like family units or family-friendly units? Do you have any insights on that?
For those situations, I would say the biggest success I found is just within the brokerage community. So I can't direct you to any specific websites. I know at my company, we have our own internal database and communication system where finding those short-term rentals for an entire apartment is something that we're constantly having conversations about in terms of, I'm looking for a client who needs this. Can anyone help me out? And I've had a lot of success that way. So shoot me an email and I'm happy to see what I can do.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen. Well, this has been incredibly informative. I think we've been able to get to almost all of the questions.
Hey guys, I really went for it with the presentation.
Well, big thank you to you, Kathleen, for joining us this afternoon. If you do have additional questions and you want to reach out to Kathleen via email, that is kathleen.lamagna@compass.com. And don't worry about recording that, because we can certainly, we will be distributing a recording of this webinar out to the audience and the alumni community beginning next Tuesday at 12 noon. So keep an eye out for that if you'd like to see the presentation again in full, or if you're just wanting to key into a specific slide that Kathleen referenced. We want to thank all of our attendees for joining us for this program. We hope you enjoyed today's topic. A special thanks to our Alumni Affairs Q&A curators, Joseph Driesen and Patrick Parma. Don't forget to sign up for our next webinar, which will be November 20th. We will be hosting Sienna Oristaglio from New York's Void Academy. Sienna will be discussing web presence for musicians and how to optimize your time and brand online. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and now on Instagram with the handle @Berklee Alumni. We look forward for you tuning in to next month's alumni webinar series. Again, my name is Fritz Kuhnlens, and from all of us at Alumni Affairs, we hope you have a great day. And thank you again, Kathleen.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.